December 1943. Camp Clarinda, Iowa. Through the frosted windows of a mess hall in the American heartland, Japanese prisoners of war stared at their dinner trays with mounting dread. Before them sat portions of beef, pork, fresh vegetables, and white bread with butter. For the third consecutive day, the fourth consecutive week, the second consecutive month, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Navy, pushed his food around his plate, his stomach twisted in knots despite genuine hunger. Next to him, Corporal Hideaki Tanaka whispered what they were all thinking. "It has to be soon now," he said quietly. "They would not feed us this well unless they were preparing us for something terrible." Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men could not comprehend, what their training and cultural understanding made impossible to believe, was that this abundance was not a prelude to execution. It was simply Tuesday. Takeshi Yamamoto had been captured 6 months earlier, near the Gilbert Islands, after his submarine was disabled during an encounter with American destroyers. He had expected to die in combat. When that failed to happen, he expected to be treated, as he knew captured enemies were treated in the Imperial Japanese forces. He expected brutality, starvation, humiliation, and ultimately, an honorable death. Instead, he found himself on a train traveling through endless fields of corn and wheat, heading to a place called Iowa, a state he had never heard of in a country he had been taught to hate. The transport had taken weeks, first to Hawaii, then to California, then by rail across mountains and deserts and plains so vast they seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the world. Yamamoto and the other prisoners traveled in guarded train cars, but they were given blankets, water, and regular meals. This confused him. In his service, enemy prisoners received minimal sustenance, just enough to keep them working. Never comfort, never kindness. Camp Clarinda sat in the southwestern corner of Iowa, surrounded by farmland that rolled to every horizon. The facility had been constructed specifically to house prisoners of war, with neat rows of barracks, administrative buildings, and a perimeter fence that seemed almost decorative compared to what Yamamoto had imagined an enemy prison would look like. When he and 300 other Japanese prisoners arrived in July of 1943, they were processed, given medical examinations, and issued clean uniforms, bedding, and toiletries. The American guards were professional, but not cruel. This, too, was bewildering. Lieutenant Robert Morrison commanded the guard detail at Camp Clarinda. A veteran of the first months of the Pacific Campaign, he had seen combat at Guadalcanal before being rotated stateside due to injuries. He had witnessed the ferocity of Japanese resistance, the unwillingness to surrender, the contempt that captured Japanese soldiers seemed to hold for themselves. Morrison understood that these men viewed themselves as dishonored, as failures who should have died rather than be taken alive. This knowledge informed his approach to running the camp. The first meals served to the prisoners followed standard United States Army rations for prisoners of war, which were based on the Geneva Convention requirements. The daily allocation provided approximately 3,000 calories per person, including meat, vegetables, bread, and occasional desserts. This was substantially more than Japanese soldiers typically received in their own service, and vastly more than Allied prisoners received in Japanese camps. But the American guards did not know this context. They simply served the prescribed portions and wondered why the prisoners seemed so anxious. Yamamoto remembered the first dinner: roast pork, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, and coffee. He stared at the tray, certain it was a mistake. Perhaps these portions were meant for the guards. Perhaps this was some kind of test. He ate slowly, carefully, waiting for the punishment that would surely follow such excess. It never came. The next morning brought eggs, bacon, toast, and jam. The prisoners ate in near silence, exchanging worried glances. By the second week, a theory had formed among the prisoners. They were being fattened deliberately. In Japanese military culture, certain rituals preceded important events. Perhaps American culture had its own rituals for condemned men. Perhaps well-fed prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to resist when the time came. Perhaps this abundance was psychological warfare, designed to weaken their resolve through comfort before the inevitable execution. Corporal Tanaka had been a fisherman before the conflict. He was practical, observant, and respected by the other prisoners for his calm demeanor. He began keeping notes in a small journal, documenting the meals, the treatment, the routines of camp life. His entries from August of 1943 revealed the depth of their collective anxiety. 8th day of month 8, he wrote, "Beef stew for lunch, fresh fruit for dessert. The guards smile when they serve us. I do not understand their purpose. Are we being prepared for medical experiments? The Americans must have some use for us. No one feeds animals this well unless they plan to slaughter them." The camp physician, Dr. Henry Walsh, noticed that many prisoners were losing weight despite the adequate rations. During routine medical examinations, he discovered that several men were eating only a fraction of their meals, often sharing portions with others or discarding food. When he asked the camp interpreter, a Japanese-American translator named James Nakamura, to investigate, he learned about the pervasive fear among the prisoners. Nakamura had been born in California to immigrant parents. When the conflict began, he volunteered for military service, eventually becoming one of the few translators willing to work directly with Japanese prisoners. He understood both cultures, both languages, and he recognized the profound disconnect between American intentions and Japanese interpretations. He brought this information to Lieutenant Morrison in September of 1943. "They think you are fattening them for slaughter," Nakamura explained. "In their understanding, no army treats prisoners this well without reason. They believe the good food is preparation for execution or medical experimentation. Some are refusing to eat because they want to deny you whatever you are planning." Morrison was stunned. He had been trying to run a humane facility, according to regulations and basic human decency. The idea that his kindness was being interpreted as a sinister plot had never occurred to him. He asked Nakamura what could be done to convince the prisoners they were safe. "You cannot just tell them," Nakamura said. "They have been trained not to trust enemy propaganda. You have to show them. Let them see American life. Let them work alongside local people. Let them understand that your values really are different from what they were taught." This conversation led to a program that would transform Camp Clarinda from a source of anxiety into something unprecedented in the Pacific Theater. Morrison proposed allowing prisoners to work on local farms, supervised but integrated into the community. Iowa was experiencing severe labor shortages due to the conflict. Farmers desperately needed help with harvest. The prisoners needed something to do besides sit and worry. It seemed like a practical solution. The first work details went out in October of 1943. Yamamoto was among them. He and 20 other prisoners were transported by truck to a farm owned by a man named George Henderson, who grew corn and soybeans on 300 acres outside Clarinda. Henderson was in his 50s, weathered by years of farm work and skeptical about Japanese labor, but he needed help and he was willing to try. The work was hard but familiar. Many of the prisoners had been farmers or fishermen before military service. They understood physical labor, understood crops and seasons. Henderson showed them what needed to be done, demonstrated equipment operation, and set them to work. He watched carefully that first day, unsure what to expect. What he saw surprised him. The prisoners worked diligently, efficiently, taking pride in doing the job correctly. They did not complain, did not slack, did not cause problems. By the end of the first week, Henderson told Lieutenant Morrison that he wanted the same crew back as often as possible. But something else happened during those farm visits. Henderson's wife, Margaret, began bringing lunch to the workers. Sandwiches, thermoses of hot soup, cookies she had baked that morning. She served the prisoners the same food she served her own family. She smiled at them, thanked them for their work, asked through Nakamura if they needed anything. This simple kindness, repeated daily, began to crack the wall of fear and suspicion. Yamamoto remembered the day he realized Americans were not monsters. He was working in a cornfield with 2 other prisoners when Henderson's young daughter, maybe 8 years old, came running out from the farmhouse. She had picked wildflowers and wanted to show them to her father. She stopped when she saw the prisoners, stared at them with open curiosity, then walked over and handed Yamamoto a flower. She said something he did not understand, smiled, and ran back to the house. Henderson explained through gestures that his daughter thought Yamamoto looked sad and wanted to cheer him up. That evening, back at camp, Yamamoto told Tanaka what had happened. "If they planned to execute us," he said slowly, "would they let their children near us? Would they give us flowers?" Tanaka had no answer. The theory that had sustained them, that explained their treatment, was beginning to collapse. November brought the harvest in full force. More prisoners were assigned to work details. They worked on farms throughout the county, picking corn, digging potatoes, repairing fences, tending livestock. The farmers paid the United States government for the labor, and the prisoners received small stipends credited to accounts they could use at the camp canteen. They could buy cigarettes, toiletries, writing materials. They were being paid for their work. This was incomprehensible. Private First Class Kenji Sato had been captured in the Marshall Islands. He was 19 years old from a small village outside Hiroshima, and he had believed every word of the propaganda about American savagery. When he was assigned to work at the Morrison farm, no relation to Lieutenant Morrison, he expected each day to be his last. The farm was owned by William Morrison and his wife Helen, who were in their 60s and had lost their only son to combat in Europe. Helen Morrison saw something in the young Japanese prisoner that reminded her of her son. The same age, the same slight build, the same nervous energy. She began treating Sato with maternal care, making sure he had warm clothes when the weather turned cold, packing extra food in his lunch, asking about his family back in Japan. Sato was terrified by this attention at first, certain it was manipulation. But Helen was persistent, and eventually her genuine warmth broke through. One afternoon in December, Sato was helping William Morrison repair a barn door when Helen brought out hot chocolate and cookies. She sat with them while they took a break, and through Nakamura, who accompanied the work detail that day, she told Sato about her son, about how he had loved farm work but wanted to see the world, about how she missed him every single day, about how she hoped someone, somewhere, was being kind to him if he was captured. Sato began to cry. He had not cried since his capture, had not allowed himself that weakness. But Helen's story broke something inside him. He told her through Nakamura about his own mother, about his village, about the propaganda that taught him Americans were demons who would torture him, about how he had been so afraid every day, waiting for the cruelty to begin. Helen took his hand and told him he was safe, that no one here would hurt him, that the conflict would end someday and he would go home to his mother. That evening, Sato returned to camp and went directly to the barracks where the senior prisoners gathered. He told them everything, about Helen Morrison, about her kindness, about her lost son. He said he no longer believed they were being prepared for execution. He said he thought the Americans actually meant what they claimed about treating prisoners humanely. The reaction was mixed. Some prisoners accepted this immediately, relieved to abandon their fears. Others remained skeptical, unable or unwilling to release their indoctrination. But the evidence was accumulating. The good food continued, the medical care continued, the work opportunities continued. Christmas of 1943 brought a feast that included turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pies, and even small gifts for each prisoner. The camp commander gave a speech about peace and goodwill that was translated carefully by Nakamura. By January of 1944, the atmosphere at Camp Clarinda had shifted dramatically. Most prisoners had accepted that they were not going to be executed. The meals, once sources of dread, became anticipated events. The work details, once suspected as preludes to death, became opportunities to earn money and interact with local people. Some prisoners began learning English. Some taught Japanese to interested guards and farmers. A baseball league formed, with teams of prisoners playing against each other and occasionally against local civilian teams. Yamamoto found himself playing shortstop, a position he had loved as a boy in Yokohama. The absurdity of playing baseball in Iowa while a global conflict raged would have been unimaginable a year earlier. But here he was, diving for ground balls, turning double plays, laughing with teammates who had once expected to die together. The transformation was not universal. Some prisoners could never reconcile their treatment with their training. They remained convinced that American kindness was weakness, that their captors were fools, that Imperial Japan would ultimately triumph. These men isolated themselves, refused to work, caused occasional disciplinary problems. But they were a minority. Most prisoners adapted to their new reality, recognizing that survival meant accepting what they could see with their own eyes, rather than what they had been taught to believe. Tanaka continued his journal. His entries from spring of 1944 showed a man grappling with profound cognitive dissonance. "I have been working at the Henderson farm for 6 months," he wrote. "Today, Margaret Henderson asked me to teach her how to prepare rice properly. She wants to learn Japanese cooking. She treats me as a teacher, as someone with knowledge worth learning. This would be impossible if we were truly enemies. I think I have been lied to about many things. I think the conflict we are fighting may not be what I believed it was." The war in the Pacific continued to intensify throughout 1944. News filtered back to the camp about battles in the Philippines, the Mariana Islands, and Burma. The prisoners learned through letters and Red Cross reports about the devastation being inflicted on Japan by American bombing campaigns. They worried about their families, about their country, about the outcome they increasingly suspected was inevitable. But daily life at Camp Clarinda remained stable. The prisoners worked, ate well, played sports, attended educational classes. Some learned trades that would help them after the conflict. Yamamoto took a course in carpentry. Sato learned basic mechanics. Tanaka studied English with an intensity that surprised his teachers. They were preparing for a future they had not expected to have. Lieutenant Morrison watched this transformation with satisfaction. He believed that treating prisoners humanely was not just morally correct, but strategically valuable. These men would return to Japan eventually. They would tell others what they experienced. They would undermine the propaganda that portrayed Americans as barbaric. Morrison wrote reports to his superiors detailing the success of the work program and the positive impact on both prisoners and local community. His reports were filed and largely ignored by higher command, but locally, Camp Clarinda became known as a model facility. Dr. Walsh documented the health improvements among the prisoners. By mid-1944, average weight had increased. Instances of depression and anxiety had decreased. The men were physically and mentally healthier than when they arrived. Walsh attributed this to adequate nutrition, meaningful work, and the elimination of constant fear. His medical records showed that prisoners at Camp Clarinda had better health outcomes than many combat soldiers, a statistical irony not lost on him. The local community of Clarinda, population around 5,000, had initially been wary of hosting enemy prisoners. But as farmers reported positive experiences with Japanese labor, as no incidents of sabotage or escape occurred, as residents encountered prisoners at work sites and found them polite and diligent, attitudes softened. Some townspeople began donating books, sports equipment, and musical instruments to the camp. The local newspaper ran articles about the work program, presenting it as an example of American values in action. Not everyone approved. Some residents believed coddling enemy prisoners was wrong, while American soldiers fought and died overseas. Letters to the newspaper complained about Japanese prisoners receiving better food than was available to civilians under rationing. Morrison received occasional threatening letters from people who thought he was too soft on the enemy. But these voices were outnumbered by those who saw practical and moral value in the camp's approach. Summer of 1944 brought the busiest harvest season yet. Nearly all able-bodied prisoners worked on farms, some traveling 20 or 30 miles from camp for extended assignments. The trust between prisoners and guards had grown to the point where supervision was minimal. Escape would have been easy, but almost no one tried. Where would they go? How would they survive in the middle of Iowa speaking no English? Most importantly, why would they leave when they were being treated well, and the alternative was returning to a conflict that was clearly being lost? One prisoner did attempt escape in August of 1944. Private Hiroshi Fukuda, who had never adjusted to captivity, managed to slip away from a work detail. He was found 3 days later, 20 miles from camp, exhausted and hungry. When guards brought him back expecting punishment, Morrison instead ordered a medical examination and a psychological evaluation. Fukuda was placed on restricted duty, but not otherwise disciplined. Morrison told him through Nakamura that he understood the impulse to escape, but that Fukuda was safer at the camp than wandering hostile territory. Fukuda never tried again. As 1944 turned into 1945, News from the Pacific grew increasingly dire for Japan. The Philippines were liberated. American forces landed on Iwo Jima, then Okinawa. The bombing of Japanese cities intensified. Prisoners at Camp Clarinda received letters from family members describing shortages, air raids, devastation. The meals they ate daily, which had once seemed like ominous preparation for death, now represented a standard of living their families could not imagine. Yamamoto received a letter from his sister in March of 1945. She described eating thin soup and a handful of rice per day. She described spending nights in bomb shelters. She described uncertainty about whether their parents had survived the latest air raid on their neighborhood. Yamamoto sat in the mess hall that evening, staring at his plate of pot roast carrots, potatoes, and bread. He thought about his sister eating watery soup. He thought about the fundamental injustice of war, where he, a prisoner, ate better than his own family. He pushed the plate away, unable to stomach the disparity. Tanaka found him later, sitting alone outside the barracks. Yamamoto told him about the letter. Tanaka nodded slowly, understanding. He said that his own family was in Nagasaki, that he had not heard from them in months, that he feared the worst. They sat in silence for a while, two enemy soldiers who had become something else. Friends, perhaps. Brothers in a strange exile that had saved their lives while condemning their families to suffer. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the prisoners at Camp Clarinda received the news with mixed emotions. Relief that the conflict was over, grief for what Japan had lost, anxiety about what awaited them at home. Many prisoners had been at the camp for 2 years. They had adapted to American life, had formed relationships with guards and local civilians, had found unexpected peace in the Iowa farmland. Now they would return to a devastated country, to cities destroyed, to an uncertain future. The repatriation process took months. Prisoners were processed in groups, transported to California, then shipped across the Pacific. Many wrote letters to the families they had worked for in Iowa, thanking them for kindness they never expected. Some exchanged addresses, promising to write after returning to Japan. A few guards, including Lieutenant Morrison, gave prisoners their own addresses, telling them they would always be welcome to write. Yamamoto returned to Japan in November of 1945. He found his parents alive, but their home destroyed. His sister had survived, but was malnourished and ill. The Yokohama he remembered was gone, replaced by rubble and makeshift shelters. He told his family about Iowa, about Camp Clarinda, about the meals he ate every day, and the farmers who treated him with respect. They listened with disbelief. His sister asked if he was making it up, if perhaps his memory had been damaged by trauma. He assured her it was all true. In the years that followed, Yamamoto worked to rebuild his life. He used the carpentry skills learned at the camp to find work in reconstruction efforts. He married, had children, built a modest house on the outskirts of what remained of Yokohama. He never forgot Iowa. He told his children about it, about the Henderson family, about Lieutenant Morrison, about how he thought he was being fattened for slaughter, but was actually being shown a different way of treating enemies. In 1952, 7 years after the conflict ended, Yamamoto wrote a letter to George Henderson. He apologized for taking so long to write, explained that he had been focused on survival and rebuilding. He thanked Henderson for teaching him that not all enemies are evil, that humanity persists even in conflict. He described his life, his family, his hopes for a peaceful future. He mailed the letter with little expectation of response. Mail between former enemies was still complicated. 3 months later, he received a reply. Margaret Henderson wrote that George had passed away the previous year, but that she remembered Yamamoto well, that she still thought of all the Japanese prisoners who had worked on their farm. She said they had been good workers and good men, and that she hoped he was doing well. She enclosed a photograph of the farmhouse, the fields, the barn door that Yamamoto had helped repair. Looking at the photograph, Yamamoto wept for the first time since returning to Japan. Tanaka's story followed a different path. He returned to Nagasaki to find that his entire family had perished in the atomic bombing. His house, his neighborhood, everything he knew was gone. He wandered for weeks, hollow and broken, before finding work on a fishing boat. The ocean, at least, was unchanged. He threw himself into work, trying to lose himself in physical exhaustion. In 1953, Tanaka emigrated to the United States. He settled in California, where a small community of Japanese immigrants and former prisoners had gathered. He opened a small restaurant serving traditional Japanese food. He never married, never had children, but he found purpose in feeding others. When asked why he came to America, he told people about Camp Clarinda, about Iowa, about meals that once terrified him, but eventually taught him that kindness was possible even between enemies. Sato maintained correspondence with Helen Morrison for decades. They exchanged letters twice a year, updating each other on their lives. Helen sent photographs of her grandchildren. Sato sent photographs of his small farm outside Hiroshima, where he grew vegetables and raised chickens. In 1978, Sato saved enough money to visit America. He traveled to Iowa, to Clarinda, to the Morrison farm. Helen was 86 years old. They sat together on the porch of the farmhouse, two old people who had been brought together by conflict and sustained by kindness. Sato thanked her for saving his life. Helen said she had only offered what any decent person should offer: hot chocolate and cookies and humanity. Camp Clarinda closed shortly after the war ended. The buildings were dismantled or repurposed. The farmland returned to agricultural use. For many years, there was no marker, no memorial, no indication that Japanese prisoners had once lived there and experienced something that contradicted everything they had been taught. But the men who passed through the camp never forgot. They carried the memory with them, told their children and grandchildren, preserved in their own ways the story of unexpected mercy in the middle of war. In 2008, 63 years after the conflict ended, a small memorial was erected at the site of Camp Clarinda. It consisted of a simple stone marker with plaques in English and Japanese describing the camp's history. At the dedication ceremony, 3 former prisoners attended, all in their 80s. They had traveled from Japan specifically for this event. They placed flowers at the memorial, bowed deeply, and thanked the assembled Iowans for what their community had done decades earlier. One of those former prisoners was Yamamoto's son, representing his father who had died 5 years earlier. He carried his father's journal, the one Yamamoto had kept during his time at the camp. The journal documented the fear, the confusion, the gradual realization that American kindness was not a trick. The son read a passage aloud at the ceremony. December 1943, his father had written, "We are given meat every day. I am certain now that we are being prepared for execution. I am terrified but determined to face death with honor. How wrong I was. How grateful I am to have been wrong." The story of Camp Clarinda represents something rare in wartime history, a place where enemies were treated not as monsters, but as human beings, where the abundance of American resources was used not for intimidation, but for basic dignity, where prisoners expected death and received life. The Japanese soldiers who passed through the camp had been trained to believe Americans were cruel and barbaric. Instead, they discovered farmers who treated them with respect, guards who followed regulations designed to protect prisoner welfare, and a community that valued hard work and fair treatment regardless of nationality. The meals that once seemed like ominous preparation for slaughter became symbols of a fundamental difference in values. The Japanese military system starved its own soldiers and brutalized enemy prisoners because it viewed hardship as virtue and cruelty as strength. The American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated on principles that recognized common humanity, even in those defined as enemies. This recognition did not erase the violence and devastation of the conflict. It did not excuse atrocities committed by either side, but it provided a glimpse of what is possible when even small groups of people choose mercy over vengeance. The prisoners who feared they were being fattened for slaughter learned instead that they were simply being fed. That simple truth transformed lives, changed perspectives, and created connections across enemy lines that persisted long after the conflict ended. It demonstrated that ideological indoctrination is powerful, but not absolute, that direct experience can overcome propaganda, and that treating people with dignity costs little but yields profound returns. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.